Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today on the program, we're going to take a look at the State of the Free Press 2024. That is the latest annual release from Project Censored, and I am joined in this segment by the co-editor of this new book, Project Censored State of the Free Press 2024. I am joined by Lee Roth. He is the Associate Director of Project Censored, co-editor of 14 editions of the Project Censored Yearbook. He helps coordinate the project's Campus Affiliates program, a news media research network of several hundred students and faculty at 24 colleges and universities across North America. In addition to co-authoring The Media in Me, Project Censored's Guide to Critical Media Literacy for Young People, Roth has published research and articles in the Index on Censorship, In These Times, Yes Magazine, Truth Out, Media, Culture, and Society, the International Journal of Press and Politics, and other outlets. He earned a PhD in sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a BA in sociology and anthropology at Haverford College. Lee Roth is no stranger, of course, to the Project Censored audience, and we welcome you back to the show, Lee Roth, to talk about the state of the free press. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Mickey. It's always a pleasure to join you on the show.
Yeah, and we've had you on the show more recently to talk about a lot of things going on around media and censorship and what's been happening in the Middle East. And today, we want to focus more specifically around the issues of censorship, the kinds of stories that we see that have been underreported in the past year. But also, we want to take a look at bigger themes around the kinds of stories that are underreported or censored. And as ever, we want to talk about the solutions. We want to talk about the intrepid independent journalists that are telling these really important stories. But to get us started, Lee Roth, let's talk about a few of the challenges that we're facing right now. Trust in journalism is really at an all-time low here in the United States. It keeps declining every year. Alan McLeod wrote about that in the foreword of our State of the Free Press 2024 book. And you talk about it, too, in the introduction. You talk about some of the challenges we have about news deserts and also about the changing habits that Americans have about how they consume news. Could you talk about a few of those things for us?
Yeah, so these are challenges, and I think of them as being challenges on both the supply side of quality journalism and the demand side of quality journalism. So on the supply side, we know from a variety of reports, including especially Northwestern University's annual State of Local News report, that about a fifth of all Americans, that would be 70 million people, live in counties where there is only one local news source or there are no local news sources. And those are what are being talked about now as news deserts. The idea that they are barren. This is, of course, this metaphor is unfair to anyone who, like I am, is a lover of deserts, and actual desert ecosystems are vibrant and alive. But the news deserts we're talking about here are a vacuum for quality journalism and therefore vulnerable to all the deleterious social effects we know ramp up when there isn't quality journalism. So things like the malignant spread of misinformation and disinformation, political polarization, eroding trust in the media, and the yawning digital and economic divide between citizens. All of these, according to Northwestern University's State of the Local News report, are amplified by the expansion of news deserts. So that's a problem on the supply side. That problem, I should add, is underscored by the fact that in many communities where there is no local news source, there also, because of historical inequalities that we've documented in past censored yearbooks, the process of digital redlining, there's also a lack of access to internet. Which means those people in those communities are doubly cut off. Not only do they live in a news desert in terms of print journalism, but they're also less likely to have the kind of digital access that many of us take for granted as a way of seeking out news and information. If you shift over to the demand side, the picture isn't pretty either. We know a lot of Americans are no longer paying attention to news. They engage in what is known as news snacking, a term used by a number of critical media scholars, including a colleague of ours, Hector Harquater, of the German News Enlightenment Initiative. Hector talks about news no longer being received consciously, but rather being consumed incidentally, like potato chips. The metaphor, the food metaphors around news that are, of course, familiar to anyone who follows Project Censored and listens to this show, I'm sure. The other dimension that critical scholars are pointing out in terms of changing news habits is not only is there this kind of incidental kind of examining of news. So you're coming across news as you're scrolling through the social media feed on your phone, on your device, while you're waiting in line at the supermarket, say. And so it's not concentrated, focused attention. It's distracted, fleeting attention to news. The other element that critical media scholars talk about on what I'm calling kind of the demand side is this idea that news finds me, and that you don't, the belief, it's a misbelief, it's a mistaken belief that if anything important I will learn about because it will come at me through, say, my Facebook feed or on Twitter or whatever. And that news finds me perception has been shown in empirical studies to lead to widening gaps in political knowledge, and also to people having people overestimating their sense of how well informed they are. They have a false sense of being well informed when they're engaged in this news finds me dynamic. The other thing about that news finds me, and this again resonates with reports from previous censored yearbooks and themes of this program, is that, of course, when we're counting on our social media to keep us informed about news in this news finds me mindset, we're dependent on platforms and algorithms that don't necessarily have a commitment to ethical journalism in the public interest. And so it's not only that we're not, the bottom line is the news may not find us due to some of those gatekeeping practices. So these are two problems on the demand side around news snacking and news finds me, and on the supply side in terms of news deserts that we address in the introduction to State of the Free Press 2024.
You know, Andy Lee Roth, that news finds me, the news snacking element, and the sort of built-in backing to that, sort of a kind of a, well, it's like Dunning-Kruger nation you just described there in many ways. And so, I mean, what you just described creates in and of itself, like each of these things being its own challenge in its own right. And when you put them all together, right, this is when we sort of have a, what we're looking at here, we've seen in the last several years, we've talked about the post-truth emergency issues. We've talked about epistemic crises, et cetera. What is being outlined here really looks in a lot of ways to be confounding, meaning that how do we then approach the challenges that we face that you've just outlined about news deserts? How do we, like, again, individually, we could go out and be less snacky, more intentional about the way in which we get information. But that does get into one of the other elements that the project focuses on, and that's critical media literacy education. And that's, well, where do people go? I mean, part of the reason why people maybe are news snacking is that they don't have they don't know what else is on the menu. Stick with the food metaphor. Yeah. They don't know what else is on the metaphor. So I'm stumbling through the menu myself here. But I'd like to talk about, also we talk about solutions, talk about reinventing journalism. We talk about the importance of public journalism. And then, of course, as you outlined in chapter 1 at great detail, these are prime examples of journalism in the public interest that show us how news snacks could be very healthy, and people can find places to go and get them themselves. They don't have to wait around for them to be found. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of critical media literacy education in the challenges that you just laid out for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think part of it is just creating a taste, to extend this metaphor perhaps to its limit, creating a taste or a hunger for quality journalism in the public interest. And I think, Peter Phillips, our colleague and the former director of Project Censored, would always talk about the idea that we have to encourage people and get people to want this, right? And so one of the things we saw, I think critical media literacy is part of that. I think the more that people have a kind of sensibility and some of the skills that come with critical media literacy, the more they want to move away from the kind of mealy, greasy, not very nutritious news content that passes as quote news on the big commercial stations, the big commercial outlets, and the more they want to dive into kind of substantive reporting that actually speaks to concerns of their own. One way, I think, to get at that is something we talk about in the introduction, which is thinking back to the golden era of muckraking journalism in the United States in the early 20th century. So people like Ida Mae Tarbull, Lincoln Stevens, Upton Sinclair, and remembering that reporting was wildly popular. It was muckraking reporting in the public interest. It skewered the comfortable and gave comfort to I'm getting the phrase wrong, right? It was truly public interest journalism, but it wasn't the niche of some elite news junkies who found interest in that. It was the mass public, to the point that the journals and outlets that had these muckrakers soon found competition from competing outlets who tried to produce the same kind of reporting themselves, because it was drawing a public attention. So one of the things I think to think about, and I don't have a full answer for this, but it's something that ought to be part of our discussion, is today we know there's an appetite for shame and scandal, right? A lot of the junk food news that Project Censored reports every year pivots on notions of shame and scandal, usually among celebrities of one sort or another, Hollywood, sports, and the like. But what if we harnessed that appetite, which I think is real and probably not going to go away? What if we harnessed that appetite to substantive reporting about genuine public issues? There's no shortage of shame and scandal out there. And so I think that's one avenue that, without descending into kind of weekly world news headlines, that journalism, that's an avenue that journalism, good, independent, investigative journalism might tap into once again 100-some years later.
Indeed. And it's important to remember, past is prologue in this regard, because we're talking about reviving this public hunger for news about what's really going on, as George Seldes, the 20th century journalist, used to always say. And the kind of stories that are highlighted each year by Project Censored, going all the way back to 1976, these are the kind of stories that really matter. These are the stories that have legs. These are the stories that have meaning, that can really change people's lives. And so journalism can really make a difference. And again, the founder of Project Censored, Carl Jensen, had long insisted that journalism is worth fighting for. And Andy, we face some of the challenges in our culture now that are very negative about just all journalism. That if you disagree with it, it's just fake news. And again, part of this ties into one of the themes that we're going to get at later in the program, and that's the way in which journalists, or the news media, particularly the corporate media, how they do and don't even cover themselves or their own industry. And so, given that the audience of citizens out there, they're kind of at the mercy in some ways of what the media will show them, of this news and editorial judgment. But we've seen that, again, this public that we have, they don't believe that they're being told the truth. They don't believe they're being told about the important stories. And worse, they now are believing that they're being purposely misled or distracted. And so we're going to have to take a break here quickly, but I want to use that as a springboard to talk about why there is hope and why there are great avenues and outlets for this kind of journalism that is in the public interest, that I think could go a long way to satisfy that news snack craving while also giving people the things that they need to be more meaningfully civically engaged. So, Andy Lee Roth, we want to continue our conversation about Project Censored State of the Free Press after this brief musical break. And after that, we're going to get into some of the kinds of stories that have been underreported. We'll look at some of the patterns of those. And we'll also talk about, we'll talk about the economy. Andy Lee Roth, before the break, we were talking more broadly about some of the trends and patterns and challenges we face in our media ecosystem today. And what I want to spend some time doing here in this next part of our segment is really going into some detail about solutions journalism, about highlighting the importance of an independent and free press, how it can function in our society. So we do want to look at maybe a few of the topics that come up each year, not just this year. But I know you want to talk about some of the patterns of the type of stories that are underreported, whether it's about economic hardship, have a lot of stories about climate and the environment. And then, of course, there are patterns of stories about media censorship and online censorship itself, literally almost a meta topic of sorts. But Andy Lee Roth, I wanted to hand it over to you because I know there's a few things that you would like to point out among these kinds of patterns that we see in underreported stories over the years. Andy Lee Roth.
Yeah, so this yearbook, the State of the Free Press 2024 yearbook, is the 31st edition of the Project's yearbook series and the 48th cohort of students working with campus affiliates of Project Censored to identify and vet and ultimately bring to wider public attention these important but underreported stories, the stories we call the top censored stories of the year. And so just to kind of give a preliminary preview, these are stories about things like activism to reform outdated laws that criminalize HIV, the economic costs of gun violence, and the discovery of toxic forever chemicals, PFAS, in our rainwater. And each of these stories is included in this year's top 25 list. But before we dive more into some of those specific stories, I think it's really important to kind of step back and think about the project as a whole. This is now, so this year's top 25 list adds to a kind of an ongoing systemic study of patterns of marginalization, bias, and sometimes outright exclusion of topics from corporate news coverage. And we can talk a lot about, the factors that shape this, but one of them is prominent in my mind, which is that journalists are, by their daily routines and their professional values, heavily focused on kind of dramatic events, which means they're less good at covering ongoing issues. And some of this may be my bias as a sociologist who thinks social structurally showing through here, fair enough. But I'm not alone in that attitude. Robert Hackett, who is the founder of Newswatch Canada, has this great line that I always think hits the mark. He talks about how for corporate news is what went wrong today, not what goes wrong every day. And so I think a lot of the stories that Project Censored has covered over the years are stories about systemic inequalities and problems. So economic inequality, systemic and institutionalized racism, environmental degradation, these kinds of broad themes all have a common denominator of being ongoing problems where, yes, on occasion, there are dramatic single events. So we just got done with the giant international climate conference, which brings some attention to climate issues and human-caused climate change. But on a day-to-day basis, climate change and environmental degradation are kind of grinding realities that don't always have a news hook that a journalist can easily peg a story on. And for these reasons, they tend to be underreported, especially relative to their significance in terms of their impacts on all of us. And so I think that's an important correction. We've talked about that in the past in terms of saying, Project Censored sees important news stories because we don't operate on a 24/7 news cycle. If we have a news cycle, it's like a 52/12,
Yeah.
right? 52 weeks, 12 months. We put out a yearbook every year that looks back at the previous 12 months of journalism and assesses where have there been successes, where have there been pitfalls, where have there been important stories that got the attention they deserved, and especially where have there been important stories that were neglected, marginalized, or blockaded. And those are the ones, obviously, that we try to focus on and draw more attention to through the top 25 story list in the annual yearbook.
Yeah, and indeed. And you and Steve Masick, who co-authored that chapter, Steve will be on later in the program today, actually wrote up a piece that we'll link later. But you wrote an analysis of sort of big energy, how they impact what gets covered, how COP28 is covered. Do you want to talk about any of the specifics around that, or do you want to talk a little bit about how that works in terms of how this kind of collusion yields to this kind of distorted or lack of coverage about any of these matters?
Yeah, so this wasn't a plan. The story selection process is a year-long process that involves hundreds of people in vetting and identifying, vetting, and summarizing stories. And ultimately, our expert panel of 28 international judges vote to rank the finalists in order for a top 25 list. So we didn't set out at the beginning of this annual cycle to get a bunch of stories about big energy and how big energy contributes to the climate crisis and at the same time hides and propagandizes its role in the creation of that climate catastrophe. We didn't set out to have a cluster of stories on that theme, but as it turns out, we do. So this year's COP25 story list includes independent journalism exposing how big energy is using financial support to skew climate and energy research at universities across the country, how fossil fuel investors have sued national governments to block climate regulations, and and then one that I think is a really interesting story because it goes to one of the most widely touted approaches to mitigating climate change, carbon offset programs. And we have independent reporting from The Guardian, from source material, and the German outlet Die Zeit, all of whom basically coordinated on a study to show that most of the carbon offset programs from the largest sponsor of those programs, Vera, are, quote, worthless. And that's not my estimation. That's the estimation of the scientists who did multiple studies of these carbon offset programs. Just to give you one example, one study conducted by scientists at University of Cambridge found that 32 of the 40 forest offset programs they looked at involved claims of emission reductions and forest protections that were 400% greater than what actually was accomplished through these carbon offset programs. Another way that they put that in context was Vera claimed that in one set of programs, they had protected an area of land in the Amazon the size of Italy, I believe, when in fact the protected area was about the size of the city of Venice within Italy. So dramatic overstatements. Now, who benefits from these? Global brands like Disney, Shell, Gucci, Netflix, United Airlines, all are promoting their environmental commitments by investing in carbon offset programs sponsored by Vera. And of course, there's an obvious conflict of interest here. Vera collects the money to do these programs, and Vera simultaneously assesses the the success of those programs. So these third-party independent assessments are the ones coming up with the conclusion that a lot of these programs are overstated. So speaking from my personal point of view here, I think this shows us how, once again, the climate crisis is not something that we're going to find purely technological solutions to, right? Carbon offset programs may help in some situations, but they are not the silver bullet that fells the climate crisis. And we really have to think about how we cut back, in not just individually but collectively, on our demands, our needs on the climate, on the environment.
Well, Andy Roth, there's even more to it with the news media's relationship with big energy, right, as well. And I know you've talked about how much money goes. You mentioned Vera and the money being paid there. Well, there's $2 billion some dollars being spent over a decade from fossil fuel companies and trade associations. And how does that play into this and play into what's happening in terms of public awareness or being able to hold these kind of companies accountable in any way?
Yeah, this is something that our colleague Steve Masick and I have been looking at, which is, why aren't these stories covered? Why do we have a cluster of big energy stories in this year's story list, right? All the stories on the story list, to reiterate for people who may be hearing about Project Censored and the top 25 stories for the first time, all the stories on the top 25 story list are there because they're important, but they've been either neglected or covered in only a partial, biased, incomplete way by corporate news outlets, right? So that means these stories and the studies that I've been citing a moment ago have not been covered in the corporate news media to any extent. Why is that? Well, one answer is the news media, the corporate news media's dependent relationship on advertising, not just from fossil fuel companies, but from other industries, related industries that are dependent on fossil fuel, like auto manufacturers and airlines, right? That economic dependence on advertising from these companies affects what kind of news we get from the commercial media. And there's an amazing study by sociologist Robert Brule and Christian Downey, co-researcher. They looked at all the fossil fuel industry advertising and promotions between 2008 2018, so a 10+ year period. And they found that during that time, fossil fuel companies and their trade associations spent a whopping $2.2 billion on advertising and promotions. Now, those ads were misleading in and of themselves. They often implied that oil and gas companies were leading the efforts to address climate change. But the other effect of those ads is a kind of this is exactly what critical media scholars have talked about in journalism for years, which is the need to have a firm wall between the editorial side of a news organization and the business side. And when there's a collective $2.2 billion in advertising at stake, it's hard to imagine that the editorial side of all these news outlets isn't being compromised by the business side, where these advertising revenues are essential to these commercial news outlets' very existence.
It's extraordinary greenwashing. I mean, it's
greenwashing. It's right,
literally.
but it's a different form of greenwashing than we usually think about. When the conventional greenwashing is the ads claiming that you name the oil or gas company is a leader in addressing climate change, right? And we've all seen those ads with the beautiful scenes of a future with clean air and not a submerged indigenous
water,
town or
cetera,
village in sight due to rising tides from global warming. But the other form of it is, right, it's the compromising of the journalistic ethics where the advertising revenues conflict with the ethical commitments to reporting in the public interest.
So speaking of ethics or lack thereof and reporting in the public interest, we're We're running out of time in this segment, and one of the issues, of course, that we had mentioned earlier was how the media don't really cover themselves very well, and they certainly don't necessarily cover issues of censorship where they have some key role, perhaps, in it. And there are, of course, as usual, unfortunately, a couple stories this year that also address these issues of regulating information under the guise of regulating disinformation. We've seen other efforts to pressure social media. Anything you want to add about some of these challenges we face moving forward, Andy Lee Roth?
We have a couple of important reports this year. One, Ken Klippenstein and Lee Fang from The Intercept reporting about how leaked documents show Homeland Security plans to regulate disinformation online. That, of course, sounds good on the face of it. Who wants disinformation online? But do we really want the Department of Homeland Security being the entity that determines what does or doesn't count as disinformation? We've written some in previous years, you and I, Mickey, about some of the Orwellian overtones of a disinformation governance board, which supposedly has been discontinued, but efforts along those lines are part of the picture. And then we also have a story based on reporting by Matt Taibbi and also Kenan Malik at The Guardian about the Twitter files and how the Twitter files reveal that there has been pressure from the US government, the federal government, agencies of the federal government on social media platforms, pressure on those platforms to suppress alternative views on them. And of course, you know, by the time the book comes out, we finish the book the book goes to the publisher in June, July. So some time has passed since the dateline on that story in the yearbook. But of course, we know, like, Twitter X now is I can't use the language I would on the air. It's a mess. But underlying that, like that, in some ways, to me, that's the ways that Elon Musk and Twitter is a mess is a distraction from these realities, which is that, and it's not, I believe, you know, we have reporting on Twitter, but there's no reason to believe that the US government is singling out Twitter for this kind of pressure. All our social media platforms are, I think, subject to this over and above First Amendment protections, and that's cause for concern on the supply side that we were talking about earlier as well.
And Andy Lee Roth, this challenge, this issue that we're pointing out here yet again, it crosses administrations. It's not just the Democrats and the Biden administration, although that's specifically what we're dealing with now. But previously, under the Trump administration, we were dealing with these very similar kinds of stories. In some instances, maybe even more egregious examples of stories. I mean, this is a bipartisan problem. And I think that in some ways, that's one of the challenges we even face at Project Censored, is trying to get people to understand what critical media literacy, education, and critical pedagogy is, and how that informs the way that we are trying to constructively critique journalism in a way that helps push it to be more informative and more in the public interest, so that we can spur meaningful civic engagement. Andy Lee Roth, there's so much more to discuss, and we've run out of time in this segment. However, I do want to give you a moment if you want to share anything else with our listeners, other things you want to point attention to. I know we have a brilliant study guide for this book. And by the way, to our listeners, you can go to ProjectCensored.org and you can see all of these stories for free. You can see all the things that Andy Roth was talking about. You can see a history of the stories going back to 1976. It's all available there for free at ProjectCensored.org. Andy Lee Roth, final words for this segment, please.
Mickey, it was a little over 100 years ago that the person who's probably the pioneer of contemporary media studies as we know them today, Walter Lippmann, himself a journalist, said, "The news about the news needs to be told." And without patting the project on its collective back too much, that's what I see Project Censored trying to do, is in this complicated, ever-shifting news ecosystem that we live in today, comprising news deserts, news snacking, all the things we've been talking about this segment and in State of the Free Press 2024. The news about the news still needs to be told. And that's what students working with the project's campus affiliates program have been doing since 1976, that 48th cohort that helped contribute to this year's book. And that's what the project will continue to do. And I think that's a niche that that story needs to be told more than ever in 2023 as we head into an election year, as we know what's happening in Gaza and Ukraine and places all over the world, and indeed here in the United States, the news about the news. So that's, I think, as good a note as I can think of to end this segment on.
Lee Roth, thanks so much for joining us again on the program. Indeed, the news about the news needs to be told, and we certainly will continue to do our part trying to tell it here at the Project Censored Show. Lee Roth, thank you so much for your important work and for joining us on the program today.
Thanks, Mickey.